The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wounded beast as rain lashed against the windows of the small, secluded cabin. Elara clutched her soaked cloak tighter around her trembling body, her breath visible in the cold air. She had been running for hours, her feet raw and bleeding, her mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. The forest had been her only escape, but now, as the storm swallowed the world in darkness, she realized she was hopelessly lost. The cabin had been a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. She had stumbled upon it just as her legs were about to give out. The door was unlocked, and she had slipped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was modest but warm, a fire crackling in the hearth as if someone had just been there. Elara hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious, but the cold was too much to bear. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She didn't hear him approach. One moment, she was alone, and the next, a deep voice cut through the silence. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my home?" Elara spun around, her eyes wide with terror. A man stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted by the flickering firelight. His face was shadowed, but she could see the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. He was dressed in simple clothes, but there was an air of authority about him that made her feel small and vulnerable. I'm sorry," she stammered, backing away. "I was lost in the storm. I didn't mean to intrude." The man stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over her. She could see the moment his expression softened, just slightly. "You're hurt," he said, his voice quieter now. "Sit down. I'll get you something for your feet." Elara hesitated but obeyed, sinking into a chair by the fire. The man moved with purpose, retrieving a basin of water and a cloth. He knelt before her, gently removing her tattered shoes and cleaning the cuts on her feet. His touch was surprisingly tender, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Elara felt a flicker of safety. "My name is Kael," he said after a moment, not looking up from his task. "You're safe here, for now. But you'll need to tell me why you were running through the woods in the middle of a storm." Elara's throat tightened. She didn't want to tell him, didn't want to relive the horror of what had driven her into the night. But something about Kael's steady presence made her feel like she could trust him, at least a little. "My name is Elara," she whispered. I was running from my stepfather. He wanted to marry me off to a man twice my age. A man who terrifies me." Kael's hands stilled for a moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were dark with something she couldn't quite place. "You're not going back there," he said firmly. "Not if I can help it." For the next few days, Elara stayed in the cabin, recovering from her ordeal. Kael was a man of few words, but he was kind in his own way. He made sure she had food and warmth, and though he kept his distance, she could feel his eyes on her whenever she wasn't looking. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that neither of them acknowledged. But their fragile peace was shattered one morning when a group of men arrived at the cabin. Elara recognized them immediately. They were her stepfather's men. Her heart sank as they demanded she return with them, their voices harsh and unyielding. Kael stepped forward, his expression hard as steel. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The men laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "She's his property," one of them said. "You have no right to keep her here." Kael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elara thought he might attack them. But then he did something she never expected. "She's my wife," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "And no one takes her from me." Elara's breath caught in her throat. Wife? What was he talking about? But before she could say anything, the men exchanged uneasy glances and left, muttering threats under their breath. When they were gone, Kael turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It was the only way to protect you. If they think you're mine, they won't come back." Elara stared at him, her mind reeling. "But we're not married," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "We could be," he said, "if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elara didn't know what to say. She barely knew this man, and yet he had saved her, protected her when no one else would. And now he was offering her a way out, a chance to escape the life that had been forced upon her. But was this any better? To be bound to a man she hardly knew, out of necessity rather than love? Elara's heart ached with the weight of the decision. She looked into Kael's eyes and saw something there. Something that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe this wasn't just about survival. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something more. And so, with a trembling breath, she nodded. Yes, she said softly. I'll marry you. The ceremony was simple, performed by a traveling priest who happened to pass through the area. Elara stood beside Kael, her hand in his, as they exchanged vows. She felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. Kael's grip on her hand was firm, as if he was silently promising to protect her, no matter what. As the days turned into weeks, Elara began to settle into her new life. Kael was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He worked tirelessly to provide for her, and though their relationship was still new and uncertain, she found herself growing more comfortable around him. There were moments when she caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race, moments when she wondered if he felt the same way she did. But their fragile happiness was threatened once again when her stepfather returned, this time with a larger group of men. They demanded that Elara return with them, claiming that Kael had stolen her. Kael stood his ground, his eyes blazing with defiance. She's my wife, he said, his voice like steel. And I'll die before I let you take her. The tension in the air was palpable, and Elara's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want anyone to get hurt, but she couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything. As the men advanced, Kael stepped forward, ready to fight. But before he could make a move, Elara stepped in front of him, her voice trembling but firm. Stop, she said, her eyes blazing with determination. I'm not going back. I'm married to Kael now, and I choose to stay with him. Her stepfather's face twisted with rage, but before he could say anything, Kael placed a hand on Elara's shoulder, his touch grounding her. You heard her, he said, his voice steady. Leave now, or you'll regret it. For a moment, it seemed like the men might attack, but then her stepfather let out a frustrated growl and turned away. This isn't over, he spat, before storming off with his men. When they were gone, Elara let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling beneath her. Kael turned to her, his expression softening. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. I would have protected you. Elara looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. I know, she said, but I couldn't let you face them alone. Not after everything you've done for me. Kael's eyes searched hers, and for the first time, she saw something there. Something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, this marriage wasn't just a means of survival. Maybe it was the beginning of something real. And as they stood there, the storm outside finally beginning to subside, Elara felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps fate hadn't been so cruel after all. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy quiet. Though her stepfather and his men had retreated, Elara knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. The claim of marriage had protected her for now, but for how long? Kael remained vigilant, always keeping a watchful eye on the forest beyond their cabin. His usual quiet intensity had grown sharper, as if he were bracing for the inevitable. Despite his stoic nature, Elara could see the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the tension between them became too much to ignore. You don't have to stay, Elara said suddenly, breaking the silence. You never asked for this. Kael turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. Neither did you. She swallowed. But I don't want you to feel trapped either. You gave me a way out, but I don't expect you to. You think I'd abandon you now? His voice was quiet but firm. Elara hesitated. I don't want to be a burden. Kael's jaw tightened. You're not. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its warmth. Then, after a long pause, Kael spoke again, his voice softer this time. I've lived alone for a long time, Elara. It was easier that way. But since you came into my life, he trailed off, as if the words were foreign to him. He let out a slow breath. You're not a burden. I want you here. Elara's heart pounded at his words. It was the closest he had come to admitting that she meant something to him. She wasn't sure what to say, so instead, she reached out, her fingers grazing his hand. Kael stilled, then slowly turned his palm upward, allowing her to intertwine her fingers with his. For the first time in a long while, Elara felt safe. But safety was fleeting. The next morning, Kael was up early, scouting the perimeter as he always did. Elara had just finished tending to the fire when she heard the distant sound of hooves. Not just one, many. Her stomach clenched. They were back. She ran outside just as Kael emerged from the woods, his expression grim. He had heard them too. Within moments, the men arrived, more than before, their armor glinting in the morning sun. And at the forefront, her stepfather sat atop his horse, his face twisted in anger. This farce ends today, he declared. You are coming home, Elara. That man has no rightful claim over you. Kael stepped in front of her, his stance protective. She's my wife. That's all the claim I need. Her stepfather sneered. Then prove it. Kael's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? The older man smirked. A duel. You win. You keep the girl. You lose, she comes with me. Elara's blood ran cold. No. Kael, you don't have to do this. But Kael's eyes never left her stepfather. His hands curled into fists, his jaw set with determination. I accept. The men cheered, already anticipating the fight. A duel to settle a marriage. How fitting. Elara grabbed Kael's arm. This is insane. He's setting a trap. Kael turned to her, his gaze steady. I won't let him take you. She saw it then, the fierce resolve in his eyes. This wasn't just about honor. This was about her. About them. Tears burned in her eyes, but she nodded. Then fight for us. Kael squeezed her hand once before stepping forward, drawing his blade. The duel was about to begin, and fate had one last twist in store. The morning sun cast long shadows as Kael stood firm, his sword gleaming in the light. Across from him, Elara's estranged guardian sat atop his horse, his expression unreadable. This farce ends today, the man declared, his voice thick with authority. Elara belongs with her family. Kael stepped in front of her protectively. She's my wife. That's all the claim I need. The older man smirked. Then prove it. A contest, one-on-one. You win. She stays. You lose. She returns home. Elara's heart pounded. Kael, you don't have to do this. Kael turned to her, his gaze steady. I won't let them take you away. The gathered men murmured, eager for the challenge. The duel would be a test of skill, a battle of determination rather than harm. At the signal, Kael moved first, his blade meeting his opponent's in a clash of steel. He was swift and precise, avoiding heavy strikes while waiting for an opening. His opponent fought with power, but Kael relied on strategy. Finally, with one well-timed move, Kael disarmed his opponent, sending the sword clattering to the ground. The onlookers fell silent as Kael stepped forward. It's over, he said firmly. She's free to make her own choices. Elara's guardian hesitated, then let out a frustrated breath. This isn't over, he muttered, turning to leave. His men followed, disappearing into the forest. Elara exhaled, relief washing over her. Kael turned to her, concern in his eyes. Are you all right? Instead of answering, she threw her arms around him. He hesitated for only a moment before holding her close. You stood up for me, she whispered. Kael's voice was gentle. I always will. Elara looked up at him, her heart racing. Then maybe fate isn't so cruel after all. As they stood together, the wind carried away the tension, leaving only the beginning of something new. A story far from over. Days passed after the duel, but the weight of it lingered. Though Kael had won, Elara knew her former guardian was not a man to accept defeat so easily. Still, life in the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Kael continued his quiet but steady care for her, ensuring she had food, warmth, and safety. And as the days stretched into weeks, the uncertainty between them softened into something else, something unspoken but undeniable. One evening, As the golden hues of sunset painted the sky, Elara sat by the fire, lost in thought. Kael entered, setting down freshly gathered wood. "You've been quiet today," he observed. She hesitated before speaking. "Do you think he'll return?" Kael was silent for a moment, then shook his head. "Not for a long while. Word will spread that you chose to stay. He won't want to lose face by returning without a plan." Elara exhaled, relieved. "Then what happens now?" Kael studied her, his expression unreadable. "That depends on you." She met his gaze. "I agreed to this marriage because I had no choice. But that's changed, hasn't it?" Kael's posture stiffened. "If you want to leave, you can. I won't keep you here against your will." Elara stood, her heart pounding. "And if I want to stay?" Kael's breath caught, his usual calm faltering for the first time. "Then you stay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. And then, without thinking, Elara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I want to stay," she murmured. Kael didn't move, didn't breathe, as if afraid she might change her mind. But when she reached for his hand, his fingers curled around hers, warm and steady. "You mean it?" he asked. She smiled, tilting her head. "For a man who fought for me, you still doubt my choice?" A slow, rare smile crossed his face, and this time, when she stepped closer, he didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. As the last light of the sun faded, Elara knew her fate had not been cruel after all. It had led her to something she never expected, a love built not from necessity, but from choice. And this time, it was a choice she made with all her heart.